Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tosfos Dibur Maschel Egez al Gabe Mayim Lav Hainu Anachase. Let's begin. Egez al Gabe Mayim Lav Hainu Anachase. In the Gemara, we said that a nut which is resting or floating on water is not considered at rest. So it'll come out that if somebody carries a nut into a rishus and he places it on a body of water, he's not going to be chayiv since the hanacha is not a good hanacha. So Tosfos is going to explain that it's not that we have a universal concept of what's considered at rest and we apply it everywhere. Rather, it'll depend on the situation. By Shabbos, Tosfos will show us what the criteria and requirements are for something to be considered at rest. And he's going to bring out kinyan. By kinyan, the requirements and criteria for what's considered at rest is different. So let's see Tosfos now inside. And even though we say in the first parak of Bava Metzia, that the ship is at rest, and it's the water that's moving it. The din is that a chotzer is kaina, a person's courtyard is kaina. The din, however, is that a chotzer ma'alechas ain't a kaina, a moving courtyard is not kaina. So the question is, if a chotzer ma'alechas, a moving yard, is not kaina, why is it that if fish jump into a ship, the owner of the ship is kind of the fish just by them being in a ship, but it's a chotzer ma'alechas. It's a moving yard. It's a moving courtyard. It's not at rest. The Gemara explains, Sfina meinech naicha. The ship is at rest. And it's the water that's moving it. So Tosfos is presenting it. He's really supporting. It's in purple because he's upholding what it says in the Gemara, that it's not at rest. And he's saying, even though it says elsewhere by kinyan that this would be considered at rest because a ship on water is the same as a nut in water. Says Tosfos, even though it says that, legabe kinyan shiny. By kinyan it's different. The loy ikri chotzer ma'alechas, because it's not considered, it's not called a chotzer ma'alechas. In other words, the requirement by kinyan in order to be considered at rest is that it should not be a chotzer ma'alechas. And we accomplish that by a ship on water, it's not considered a chotzer ma'alechas. So really this is the whole of Tosfos. It's going to continue to explain this further and then a side discussion. But this is the whole of Tosfos in the sense that Tosfos is pointing out that it's not a universal, there isn't a universal idea and concept of what's at rest, and it applies everywhere, but rather in each situation there is a different criteria and different requirements. And by kinyan, the requirement is that it shouldn't be a chotzer ma'alechas. And by Shabbos, that's not what we look at, a chotzer ma'alechas. Now Tosfos is going to explain further what are the requirements by kinyan, what does it mean not to be a chotzer ma'alechas, and what does it mean not to be considered moving by Shabbos, to yet be considered at rest. So Tosfos explains, the chotzer yalfinin miyad, because the din of chotzer we learn that from a person's hand, just like a yad is kaina, a chotzer is kaina. V'yad nami, and also by a hand, it's the same as a ship. Iu dekam maski tuto v'kamimatilo. He walks and he brings it with him. In other words, just like by a person, his hand is at rest, but as he walks, the hand moves. The same is true by the ship. The ship is at rest, but as the water moves, the ship moves. And therefore, it's not considered mahalechas. It's not considered in motion. Rather, it's considered at rest because it's the same as a yad. So by kinyan, the way we look at it is it similar to the hand of a person? And since a ship on water is similar to the hand of a person, it's considered to be at rest. However, by Shabbos, aval hacha, but here, mim mishkan yalfinim, we learn it from the Mishkan. V'sham lo hayim estama, and over there, it probably was only in the manner that people store their items. In other words, if somebody wants to set something aside, how would they do it? In the Mishkan, they would do it in the regular way. And therefore, Rava says, if somebody had a nut and he wanted to store it, he wanted to set it aside, he would not take it and place it on a body of water. And therefore, it's not at rest. So it comes out that by kinyan, this is the first part of Tosfos, then we're going to move to a side discussion. It comes out that by kinyan, what we look at, is it similar to yad? If it's similar to a person's yad, a person's hand, then it's considered at rest. And by Shabbos, what we look at is this a way that a person would set aside an item? If somebody wanted to store an item, would he do it in such a manner? And therefore, since that's what we look at, we say, Egez al gabe mayim lav hainu anachase. A nut on top of water is not a proper hanacha because a person would not set aside a nut to be on top of water if he wanted to store it. Now Tosfos says, based on this explanation, the main one that we're focusing here is Shabbos. Based on this explanation, that what we look at is, would a person do this? It'll explain something else to us. And he asks, if there's a nut in a kli, in a container, and the container is floating on water, is this the manner that people set aside items or not? If a person had a nut, and he wanted to set it aside, and there was a container floating on water, would he place it over there? He asks whether this is hanacha. Rava has a question, what's it based on? Would a person do such a thing? Is this a normal behavior? And there's two ways of looking at it. That's why Rava has the question. One way is to say, yes, this is a normal thing for people to do, to place a nut into a container that's floating on water. And another way of looking at it is to say that it's not normal. It says Tosfos, afal gav de vade lav kemunach dami, even though it's certainly not considered generally at rest. Nevertheless, we still have the question, because our question is not built on a universal concept of what's considered at rest, but rather, would a person place an item, would a person set aside an item in such a manner? And if he would, then it'll be considered at rest in this case, even though in other cases it won't. And if he wouldn't, then it will not be considered at rest, even if in another case it will. Now Tosfos is going to continue on to show us how this case, when the eggs is in the kli, and the kli is floating on the water elsewhere, and even in Shabbos, it will not be considered at rest. And nevertheless, over here we have a question whether it's considered at rest, because we have to zero into the specifics. And the specifics are, would a person take a nut and place it on a container that's floating in water? And if we find an equivalent case, even by Shabbos, we might say it's not at rest, because that's not considered something that a person would do. But this, a person would possibly do, and therefore could be considered at rest. So now we're going to present the other three places where we see that the equivalent to a nut in a container on water is not considered at rest. The Kaimalon, because we established, it's established to us, the Rochov Kamahalach Dami, that one who's riding as if he's moving. The din is that if a person's teacher is walking by him, his Rebbe is walking by him, he's chayav to stand up out of derech eretz. If the Rebbe is sitting, he doesn't have to stand up. The din is that if the Rebbe is sitting on a horse, he's riding a horse, the student needs to stand up, because we say Rochov Kamahalach, one who's riding is like he's moving. And Tosfos is comparing a Rochov to our case. Just like the person is sitting on the horse, the person's at rest and the horse is moving, so too the eges is in the container that's moving. The eges is at rest in a container that's moving. Nevertheless, by the eges we have a question, and by Rochov we say Kimahalach is like it's moving. Now Tosfos is going to bring the second place we see this. Over Reish Perek Basra, and in the beginning of the last Perek, in Masechta Shabbos, mashma nami, it also seems the imnoisen al adam kishuhuma alech, that if somebody places something on a person as he's walking, so even by Shabbos we see this, the loy choshev hanacha is not considered at rest. That means if somebody is walking and another individual places an item onto him, it's not considered a proper hanacha. So we see that the item being placed on the person is similar to the nut in the container. The item is on a moving person; it's at rest on a moving person. The nut is at rest in a moving container. Nevertheless, over there, Tosfos will show us how we say it's not considered at rest, and over here we have a question: how do we see over there it's not considered at rest? The Ka'amar, it says over there, if a person has an item that he was carrying Erev Shabbos and he realizes he won't make it home on time, when the animal's walking, as it's walking, he places the item onto the animal, and then when the animal stops, he lifts it up. The reason for that is, he doesn't want to put on the animal when it's stopping, because then the animal's going to do the malacha of carrying. The animal's going to walk with it and stop. And we say that the akira is a good akira, the anacha is a good anacha, like we learned, so the animal would have done the malacha. Therefore, he waits till the animal's walking, and once the animal's walking, he places it on the animal. This way, the animal doesn't have the akira. And the Mefarshim explain how, but from here we see that the anacha is not a good anacha, that as the animal's walking, he places it on her. This indicates that it's not considered a good hanacha. And again, the Mefarshim explain how we see that over there. But at any rate, Tosfos is just bringing out that it's not a good anacha, even though it's the equivalent. We have the moving animal, and the item is at rest in it, and the moving container, and the egg is at rest in it. And now for the last and final place, Tosfos brings it out. We also say in Perek HaMeitzi, again, it's a Perek in Masechta Shabbos, if somebody carried out from the Rishus HaYachid, ink in the amount of 2 letters, and he wrote these letters. He wrote them on a piece of parchment, a piece of paper, as he's walking. Chayev, he's chayev. The writing of these letters, it's their hanacha. Mashma, it seems that dafka ksavan, specifically if he wrote them, which is what's unique about that. That he placed them in a place that they're going to stay there forever. Then he's going to be chayev. However, if he would have taken the ink and poured it into another kli that he's holding, it would not be considered hanacha, since he's moving. And this is a direct equivalent. It's exactly similar to our case. In the case of the ink, we see that the person took the ink, which is in a container, and he pours it into another container, which is being moved by a walking person. And the same thing with the nut. It's being placed in the container, like the ink in the container, and the container in one case is being moved by the person, and the other one by water. Nevertheless, over here we say it's not going to be hanacha. And the case of the nut, we have a question, because the focus by Shabbos is, would a person do this? And that's a question that we'll have by the nut. It's possible that a person, if he wants to set aside a nut, he will place it into a container that's floating on water. And therefore we could have the question, even though elsewhere we'll say it's not a hanacha, and even elsewhere by Shabbos we'll say that it's not a hanacha.